To me, it looked like a big hulk of steel. It looked so tall, it seemed to reach the sky. And it looked so long, it seemed to be no end to it. And I said, "But Dad, how could that ship stay up in the water?" "Oh," he said, "son, that ship will always stay up in the water." Well, you see how wrong he was.
Belfast, Northern Ireland, an ancient city on the doorstep of Europe, where industry and commerce flourished for centuries. Today, it's better known as a city recovering from almost 4 decades of political violence. The world has been all too familiar with the tragic images that became synonymous with the name of Belfast. However, almost 100 years earlier, Belfast was to be linked with a very different tragedy, the memory of which was to haunt the city for much of the 20th century. In this film, we will hear the voices of local people who witnessed the construction of the Victorian era's greatest maritime accomplishment, and the experts and enthusiasts who are determined to embrace the legacy of the RMS Titanic and give her back to the city that gave birth to her.
Sammy's that drink I smell of you. Look, do you not think times is hard enough without you spending what money we do have on beer?
And you're wasting it. Have great news. The lads are telling me they're building 2 new ships in the yard, the Olympic and the Titanic, and they're looking men to work on the Titanic.
Do you think our Willie could get a job?
It's no bother. The lads are saying there's loads of apprenticeships going. I'll put a word in.
Sammy, that's great news.
It was really busy. I mean, this was probably the biggest output of tonnage in the United Kingdom at that time. There were 2 shipyards here at the time, Harland and Wolff, and a smaller shipyard called Workman Clark. Harland and Wolff were referred to as the big yard, while Workman Clark were referred to as the wee yard. But in those days, I mean, in 1912, for example, there were 12 ships launched that year in Harland and Wolff. And really, as soon as one ship was launched, the slipway was cleared and the keel was laid for the next ship that was going to be constructed. So this really was, in Belfast here, the centre of shipbuilding for the United Kingdom and for the world as well.
Belfast was unlike any other Irish city. It was a major industrial centre, manufacturing, engineering and of course shipbuilding. And shipbuilding was really the most important industry in Belfast at that time. It had expanded quite rapidly from the mid-19th century, and by the time Olympic and Titanic were built, Harland and Wolff employed about 15,000 people, and the shipyard had become the largest in the world.
The conditions for the workforce were really hard at that particular time. They were required to start for 6 in the morning, working through to about 5:30 in the evening. And in fact, if they didn't get in for 6 o'clock, the gates were shut and they were locked out for an hour and not allowed in until 7 o'clock, and then had their wages docked by an hour for the loss of that hour. But basically there were 3 ways of gaining employment in the shipyard in Titanic's time. One was as a premium apprentice, and that's where your family would pay the shipyard to train you up as a gentleman apprentice. And you would really become a master of no trade. You'd become a jack of all trades. And after that, you'd be given a position as a junior manager and work your way up through that. The other way was then to come in and do the standard apprenticeship, where you would come in and do 5, 6 or 7 years of an indentured towards an apprenticeship. And again, your parents would have to pay a fee to Harland and Wolff for you to come into the shipyard. And the last way, and I always think a very cruel way of gaining employment, was the casual labour scheme. That was where in the morning you would find several hundred labourers standing outside the yard. The foreman would come out knowing that he needed maybe 50 or 60 men for the day, and would pick those men that he needed. And if you didn't get work at that particular time, there was no state benefits, so there was no money coming into the house, there was no food on the table. So it was quite a hard way to work at that particular time.
My father was a joiner who worked in Harland and Wolff all his lifetime. He had a great pride, as many others had, in the building of this great ship. And I used to see pictures in the newspapers. When I was a wee fella, I used to draw wee pictures of the Titanic, with the four funnels and the smoke coming out. But I was all thrilled on one occasion. He said to me, "Johnny, I'm going to take you down on Sunday afternoon to see the Titanic." I couldn't wait until Sunday arrived. And we went down in a tram car to the Queen's Road. There he took me through the gates of the great shipyard. And just looking to the right, I saw this big, to me it looked like a big hulk of steel. It looked so tall, it seemed to reach the sky. And it looked so long, it seemed to be no end to it.
I took great interest in everything that was happening around me, particularly the great ship, the Titanic. And this ship was being built by Ulster people who had no coal and no iron. But the Ulster people were extremely able, and the ship rose, and they brought in the anchors in drays, which were drawn by 20 horses. And I couldn't imagine how this ship was going to get into the water.
My dad started explaining to me, he says, "You notice that it's lying at a slope and it's been propped up with all those logs. Now, in a few weeks' time," he said, "men called stagers will come along and they'll take all those logs away, and the ship will slide down into the water because there's grease below it."
On May the 31st, 1911, Titanic rolled down its slipway to meet with the sea for the first time.
My father took me to the launch, and it was a lovely day, sunshine, brilliant sunshine, and the smell of the sea and of the shipyard, and thousands of workers and people waiting for the great event, and all the ships lying off, waiting for the launch. And suddenly a flare flamed into the sky, and the chocks were knocked away, and the hydraulic rams gave it a gentle push, and 30 seconds later it was in the water. It made a huge splash, and the sound of the withholding chains dragged along was terrific. And then the cheers broke out.
Well, the Titanic's a very evocative name. It's been with me all my life, right in childhood. My father actually worked on the Titanic. He came out of his time when the Titanic was launched, and he became from being an apprentice, he became a journeyman metalworker.
My father told me again, "I'm going to take you down to see the Titanic." And this time it looked more like a boat to me because it was in the final preparation stages for going away. It had the four funnels, the captain's bridge, the masts, the lifeboats, and the gangways were all placed on it, and the workers were going up and down carrying furniture on board and all sorts of electrical fittings. And I thought it was wonderful just to see it all. There it was in all its grandeur.
It was shipbuilding at the height of its powers in Belfast, and those beautiful staterooms, all those finishing trades, and all the marvellous staircase inside the ship and everything. Something that the city would have been and should have been proud of.
They had to do in Harland Wolff the sea trials for the vessels, and Titanic's was scheduled for the 1st of April 1912. They arrived down early in the morning, very early in the morning, and getting the ship ready to go for the sea trials when the weather was so bad that they waited and waited and waited, and finally late afternoon or early evening they made the decision that they couldn't do the sea trials because the weather was so bad, and it was abandoned for the day. They then came back on the 2nd of April and decided to do a shortened sea trials. Normally, whenever Harland Wolff did their sea trials, they came out of Belfast Lough and headed north towards Glasgow. But for Titanic, they came out and sailed south towards the Isle of Man, taking a lot shorter route. They left early in the morning, returned back in round about 6 o'clock in the evening, where the ship was turned around. At around about 8 o'clock at night, Titanic weighed anchor and started on her voyage over to Southampton, going out of Belfast Lough.
I watched the trials up and down Belfast Lough. It was a huge ship, and it was so big, it made the loch look quite tiny. It was a remarkable thing, but I was entranced by this, and eventually I watched her go off on the 2nd of April.
What's keeping you? We're going to be late. You're going to miss him. What's the matter with you? This should be a proud day. Our son's sailing on the Titanic. Not everybody gets a chance to get it.
Sammy, I'm just worried about him. He's my wee son going that big ship.
He's 17. And anyway, they say it's the safest ship's ever been built. He'd be alright.
Suppose you're right. He's a lucky boy going in that ship. I'll go and get my coat.
That was some occasion. There were thousands and thousands of people, and we saw the Titanic coming up, being towed by the tugboats, as they were called. This is one of my favourite pictures of the Titanic being towed up the Belfast Lough.
They were still doing the cosmetic details in it. They were still painting it and cleaning it. In fact, I spoke to one gentleman some years ago whose father painted the ship and travelled on Titanic over to Southampton, still painting away at the vessel. And really, I think the whole thing was, if you saw anything that looked wet, don't touch it in case the paint hadn't dried yet. Even when they arrived in Southampton, there was a change made on the ship, on both sides of the ship, and the internal decorations of it. And still, right up until the last moment, they were practically working on the ship.
My friend Ralph Friars, who passed away, and I was with him at the time, the last thing I collected from him, and he had rolled it up and he'd written my name on it. And it was a beautiful drawing he'd done for the Titanic Society. And it's a marvellous view of the ship going up the loch, and you drew in the loch sides at each side where you could see it going out. And in the foreground, what Raoul loved about it was, he said, this is before the tragedy. He said it was a cause for great celebration. So all his characters in the foreground are cheering and roaring and drinking bottles of stout and waving. That's typical of Raoul. He said, this wasn't a tragedy. This was a celebration. The tragedy happened later. It was something that the city was so proud of, the shipyard men were so proud of.
When it got to about Bangor, all of a sudden you could have heard the swish of the propellers, and the tugboats would release themselves, and the Titanic steamed away to Southampton. And of course, we all waved it goodbye with our handkerchiefs, and we sang Rule Britannia. Little did we think it was, sadly, indeed, goodbye.
On April the 15th, 1912, 4 days into her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, the Titanic struck an iceberg. The wound to her hull would prove too great to survive.
Titanic sinks! Over 1,000 lives lost! Belfast pride hits an iceberg! Latest news of survivors!
Oh no, not Willie!
I can remember well the day the news came that the Titanic was sunk, and these wee paper boys were running up the streets with the newspapers under their arm and a wee poster in front of them with two significant words. I'm sure you could guess them. Titanic sunk. And my father came out to the door, and he just broke down and cried like a child.
There were 36 people on board Titanic from this part of Ireland when she set sail, and sadly 28 of those were to die. In some ways it was very sad that it was nearly forgotten about in Belfast. I mean, at one stage, whenever the news came through in Belfast, grown men were seen standing crying in the streets. But sadly, quite quickly, the news of Titanic was put to one side and forgotten about, and really wasn't talked about for many, many years to come.
Titanic really was the world in miniature. We had rich and poor, workers, labourers, managers, officer class, all on board. And when the ship sank, it was as though the whole world had upended itself. In Belfast, there was profound shock and grief at the loss of Titanic. Not so much for the loss of the ship, but for the Belfast people who had gone down with her. And in the shipyard, the sense of grief was for the loss of their former friends and colleagues who would not return. Another Titanic could be built, indeed was built, it was her sister ship Britannic, but that the lives which had been so tragically lost could never be replaced.
On that night there were really so many heroes, but one that really stands out was Thomas Andrews, the chief naval architect who was travelling on board the ship in charge of the Harland Wolff Guarantee Group. He was seen advising others to get warm clothing on and get as quickly as they could to the lifeboats. And he was actually seen at one stage near the end making no attempt to save himself whatsoever. He went down with the ship that he helped create. The one thing about Titanic was it happened over such a long period of time compared with other disasters. I mean, the ship hit the iceberg on the evening, and it wasn't at sort of 20 to 12 in the evening, and it wasn't until 2:20 the next morning that the ship sank. These people knew what was ahead of them. When you think of things like the Herald of Free Enterprise, if you think of the Twin Towers, which happened within a couple of hours, if you think of the Challenger disaster as well, which happened really in front of our eyes on the television, they didn't have a chance to question what was happening or going on. But here, for about 4 hours nearly, they would be able to question that the ship was sinking. There was nobody near them to help them. The nearest ship was 60 miles away that was coming to their assistance, and they were very much on their own with a limited number of lifeboats. It would have been a terrible position to have been in.
Everybody called the Titanic the unsinkable ship. And everybody, their pride was hurt, my father especially, when they heard that it had sunk. And not only because it was sunk with all the great grandeur on it, all the beautiful workmanship, but all the lives that were lost. It was very, very sad.
And that's when it became the shadow over the city and the shadow over the shipyard. All the men felt a sense of the fact that it was a ship that they built, went down with all that loss of life. Wasn't their fault at all, of course. They couldn't believe it. They just never got over it, and I think they felt a sort of that somehow there would be a collective blame that nobody would be able to ever get to the bottom of. It was a ship that they built.
Titanic was not the only ship in Harland Wolff's yard at that time. The yard was on an expansionist boom, and there were 7 or 8 other ships being built simultaneously with Titanic. They're actually known by their numbers. Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, was 400, and Titanic was number 401. Olympic was actually brought back to Belfast and fitted with sufficient lifeboats. Her double bottom was raised. In fact, they tried to make her actually unsinkable.
When the inquiries were over in 1912, especially the British inquiry, Harlands were quite content that they had done nothing wrong, that the ship was a perfectly good ship, and they were more or less exonerated by the inquiry. So, but they were reluctant, right up until maybe the 1970s, to open up this debate again, because there had been a lot of uninformed opinion, which is almost impossible to answer, because these questions still keep coming, and no matter how logical Harland's response would have been, it would not have satisfied the people.
I think that it has more been some kind of shadow that has been connected to us for some time, that we didn't like to talk about it. However, What that is important to know is, of course, that the rules to which the ship was built is still the rules that are covering the world today. Nothing have changed in connection with how the ship was built. The only thing that has changed, that is the number of lifeboats. So there's now a seat for every passenger. That is, of course, a little bit strange to look back in time and see that was not the case at that time. But otherwise, the way the ship is designed today is exactly the same way as Titanic was built at that time.
Really, I think it was just the shame of such perhaps a large loss of life at that particular time that happened. But really, Belfast had nothing to be ashamed about. Here we had built, not just Titanic, I mean, she was one of thousands of ships built here in Belfast, but built of the best steel, the best rivets, by the best workmen in the yard, leaving Belfast the biggest and best ship in the world. Really, we had nothing to be ashamed about in Belfast. What happened was a disaster, really. Titanic, the ship wasn't.
Since that fateful night in 1912, Titanic has become a fascination for many whose lives have been touched by her legacy. Not least Belfast naval architect David Livingstone, who dived 2 miles below sea level to see the wreck up close.
The first thing I saw, because we arrived at the bow, and the bow was looming up out of the mud and out of the darkness, and you had to be pretty close before you could actually see it. It looked absolutely immense because you were right down the seabed and it was looming over you. When you moved along the forecastle deck, saw the windlass, the anchor arrangement, the chains, which are still there, the little davits for the chains, and then you moved down the hull, could see the plating, could see the rivets, see the number of rivets that were, the number of rows of rivets, and how they were put together was really quite an impressive sight. We sat on the bridge for a little while. We were putting down some experiments to try and see what the rusticles were doing, because they're living organisms. It was really just at the front of the bridge, just in front of where the wheel would be. The foundations of the bridge were still there, which is about the only bit of wood that you would see on the ship. And you had got to wonder about what the last people who were walking on that bridge, what they were thinking about, as they more or less knew that the ship was doomed. And this beautiful ship on its maiden voyage was going no further.
However, the whereabouts of Titanic's wreckage had remained a mystery since she met with the seabed in 1912, until in 1985, a former US naval officer made a sensational discovery.
When we found the Titanic, we were naturally excited, elated, because it had been a hard-fought battle to track her down. She'd put up quite a resistance to all the previous expeditions. So we were celebrating. But then someone in the control room looked at the clock and said she sinks in 20 minutes, because it was 2 in the morning and she sank at 2:20. And that innocent comment was, we were embarrassed that we were celebrating anything. And it was like someone took our mood and turned on a wall switch, and we went from being the professional that was excited about their accomplishment to the human who realized that we were at that spot. We were where it all happened, and it spoke to us. It was like the ground speaking to us. And so we went into a very somber mode, and someone had brought a Harland and Wolff flag, and we went out on the stern of the ship and raised the flag. It was 2 in the morning and had a quiet moment, and the mood never changed from then on out. It was just serious documentation, very somber.
Model maker Ronnie Hope devoted his free time to creating lifelike models of Titanic from the actual ship's plans.
She was the ship, the #1 ship in the world at that time. And then to have gone down on our maiden voyage before she'd even completed her first voyage, it was tragic, really tragic. And that, to my mind, when I'm building this thing, it's never far away from my mind. It's a great pity, indeed. To the Harland and Wolff workers themselves, who took such pride in making it, and then to have the thing go down within a few days, must have been a terrific shock to them. And I can't understand, I can't imagine really how they would feel about it. I mean, not having worked on the thing myself, but having worked on this model, I can feel for them. You know, they must have been a terrible shock. I can imagine them, the people running down the decks, the promenade and the boat deck, to try and get to the ship and see that the water gradually coming up forward. It is an emotional occasion when you're working at it.
Long before Kate and Leo cavorted on the Titanic's prow, Belfast filmmaker, the late Bill McQuitty, made what many consider to be the definitive movie about the doomed liner.
Walter Lord's book took 20 years to write, and he interviewed the survivors, and he knitted everybody in the ship together so that he knew what any particular person was doing by knowing what they were talking to somebody else. They were all cross-referenced through the thing. When I got the book and I went to John Davis for the money to make the film, he said, "Bill, it's just another shipwreck. And besides, it's been done before. You know, there have been lots of shipwreck films." And I said, "John, this is not just another shipwreck. It's the end of an era." And he said, "None of your Irish blarney, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, in the memorial to the Titanic in the City Hall and the War Memorial was 1914, and the Titanic Memorial was in 1912. And on the Titanic Memorial, the names of the dead are in order of importance. And on the War Memorial, they're in alphabetical order. And that was the change. It was an end of an era. No one ever thought the same again. It wrecked Victorian arrogance. My film had 200 speaking parts. It had just as much attention to the third-class passengers and the second-class passengers as the first-class passengers. And it involved them all in it because they felt everyone in the theatre had a connection through one or other of the people on the ship that was similar. I had Alexander Wyszynski, who was the best set man in the world, and I said we need to build a third of the ship, the center third, which will have 2 funnels and 4 lifeboats, and will be the right size. And we had the blueprints, and so for him it was straightforward. But everything was absolutely correct. And when Edith Russell came to see me, she was a terrific lady and full of energy and very much involved with the Titanic. I said, "Edith, I'd love to have you advising us. You can be at my side and tell me if you think we're going wrong. And I took her onto the ship eventually, and she walked around the deck and she stood where she was when it went down, and she said to me, "Bill, you've done a wonderful job. This is exactly, you've got the ship absolutely right, but you still need me, because I know what happened in the lifeboats and at the time." I had to lower the lifeboats into the water. And I had this in the Southampton line on their turnaround in the docks of London. And they had agreed, and I had big lighters with huge lights on, and I had hundreds of extras already for the lowering sequence. And this was to start on Friday, on the weekend. And I had to do Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then they wanted the ship back again. And suddenly the port captain rang me up, and very upset, and said that the chairman of the Southampton line refused to allow me to do this. They felt it was bad for business. And I had to think very quickly. I went to the P&O, they refused point blank. And then I took a plane, I went up to the Clyde. And I found the shipbreakers, W.H. Ward, and they were breaking up the Asturias, which was Churchill's flagship. It was white. I got the Glasgow Art College to paint the ship black. I had the proper davits and the proper lifeboats. I said to the chairman, I said, "I only want to shoot this at night. You can go on breaking up your side that they were working on, and you leave my side to me at night for 10 days. How much will you charge?" And he said, £100. He was delighted to do it. And I said, "Well, can you give me a contract for that? Because I think there may be ructions." So he gave me that, and sure enough, I got a telegraph the next day saying, "Don't have anything to do with McQuitty." We spoke on the telephone, and I sent me a lovely Christmas card, which said that the ripple from my ship, my Titanic, had gone round the world, and this was one of the repercussions that had come up. He used my film, and it was to get the thing accurate, but he would never let that interfere with the love story. His film had about 8 speaking parts, and it was about 2 young lovers. And in order to make the thing more dramatic, he sank the ship vertically instead of horizontally, because there's no excitement in water creeping up like a thermometer slowly. And of course, when you're dealing with a love story, it's a different matter. And in the iceberg thing, the loving couple are not only in the bows, but they're standing on the rails. And they're going 23 knots through sub-zero thing, and their hair is blowing in the wind, and they've been frozen. And the lookouts, instead of watching for lifeboats, are watching them canoodling, you see. And suddenly, when they look up, there's the lifeboat, and the fellow says, "Ah, shit," and rings the bell. But this is good for love stories.
Not all Titanic love stories are fictional.
There was a Titanic convention held in Belfast, and Ian was Lord Mayor at the time, and I met him through the convention, which ended in the City Hall with a banquet, and a number of strange events led to me being left completely alone that evening. So I ended up dancing the rest of the evening away with Ian. So in a strange way, the Titanic brought us together.
I saw this beautiful young woman who was like a vision, and to have her associated in any way with the Titanic was wonderful to me. I was brought up in the little village of Conlig, just outside Newtownards and near Comber, and it was there that Lord Pirrie spent his boyhood, and he was a great hero to me in my youth. He was the man who really thought of the Titanic and built the Titanic. So that the Titanic was something to me that was very, very special. And when I saw this wonderful girl in this room, which was almost like the great rooms in the Titanic, it was just like a vision to me. My relatives had actually worked on the Titanic and had come up from Conlig to work there, and some stayed in Belfast, so I had a link with the Titanic that way. But there were other sort of relationships with the Titanic over the years which I thought were very interesting. Andrews, who was the chap who designed the Titanic, was the nephew of Pirrie, and his mother came from Conlig as well. So therefore it seemed to me full of Conlig characters, the Titanic. My grandmother went up to see the Titanic on the maiden voyage, but as many people did in those days. So that all in all, the Titanic to me, as it still was the most important thing to ever come out of Ireland, and certainly the most well-known thing to be associated with Belfast. And so I've loved the whole story of it over the years.
We decided for our honeymoon that we would take the Titanic route, so to speak, and we travelled to Southampton to catch the QE2 and travelled to New York. Passed over the spot where the Titanic went down, didn't we?
We did. We had it completely authenticated that we were over the side of the Titanic. And it was funny, it was announced over the ship's radio internally that we were passing in all the different languages, German and Japanese and French, which was very interesting, and people started to talk and chat around about the Titanic. So it really is a very well-known theme. Kerry was actually in a book of Harland and Wolff, you know, her whole lineage, since Kerry is actually collaterally descended from all the main characters here. She's the sum total that is left really of Thomas Andrews, who designed the Titanic, and of the Pirries who built them, and of many of the other great commercial people of the day. So that, you know, really the past, the present, and perhaps the future are all bound up nicely together in Kerry herself, certainly for me.
Today, Belfast is a very different city. A vibrant and busy cultural centre enjoying the economic benefits of a decade of peace. As our people work to put the political differences behind them, they are now also ready to embrace the legacy of Titanic.
I love this. Here's her firework. Whereabouts did it hit the iceberg, Josh?
It hit it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
Atlantic Ocean. And can you remember the name? The place where it hit? Flula. Newfoundland in the Atlantic Ocean. So did it get to New York? No, it didn't get to New York.
2012 will see the centenary of the great ship's completion, and Belfast is now a city that wants to celebrate her.
We're unique in some ways in Belfast that we can look and celebrate Titanic. The rest of the world commemorate Titanic, but we can certainly celebrate the ship.
I think it's fine to be celebrating the building achievement of Titanic. It has become, in a way, a symbol of regeneration. But of course, for the world, it's the great symbol of disaster. So there are different sides to Titanic. But I think in Belfast, I think what we must have is the perspective of commemoration of the loss of Titanic. Not just the loss of the great machine, but what we must commemorate is the loss and remember is the loss of all those people on board who died in the most appalling circumstances imaginable.
My great-grandfather was a cabinet maker, and we have a Titanic chessboard which he had made of offcuts of Titanic wood. So it's always been in my family lore. Titanic was there, the chessboard was there. And then in 1985, when Ballard discovered the wreck of the Titanic, the rest of the world got terribly excited, but there was nothing happening here. So myself and a few others thought, right, why should we not have a Titanic Society here? Because they're all over the world. But not here in the place where she was longer than anywhere else apart from where she now lies. I mean, given the Titanic was only in the world scene from the 2nd of April 1912 when she left here until she sank in the 5th, 13 days, and yet is probably the most famous ship in the world apart from the Ark perhaps. But how many people know she was built in Belfast? She's got Liverpool across the back of her, and she left from Southampton. So what I felt most strongly is that we have to place Belfast in her correct position in the Titanic story, and forming a society was a step in the right direction.
We have had the table about 10 years. It was in a store in Harland and Wolff's. They offered it to us if we wanted to put it on show. And as we have the public and so on through here on occasions, we thought it'd be something very nice for them to come and look at. It was built actually for the Titanic in 1912. It was built by Harland and Wolff's own tradesmen. And as sometimes happens in this part of the world, it wasn't quite ready on time for the vessel sailing. So the story has it that it was actually sent to Southampton to await the return of the ship. But we all know what happened on its maiden voyage. And apparently then the table was eventually sent back to Harland and Wolff's, and it remained in Harland and Wolff's until it was displayed here.
I think historically there's always been a sort of a thwarted pride in Titanic, the great lost ship. But attitudes have changed over the years. But today Belfast has appropriated Titanic much more as the international brand, fusing profit and pleasure and memorialisation.
Yes, we are standing here talking about Titanic because she sunk, but yet let's use her as a hook to attract visitors to this other proud maritime history that we haven't told the world about before. Even to come into this room now, you get the impact of this room. It's a beautiful building. It is going to be restored to its former glory and is the whole heart of the story. This is where the dreams that were in Ismay's head were put down on paper, and just out that window is where those plans of paper became a ship of steel.
The dockland spaces where Titanic took shape, for years left for wasteland, are now a hive of energetic construction as Belfast prepares to remember. The area even has a new name, the Titanic Quarter. Eric Kuhne is the architect commissioned to design the quarter's showpiece, Titanic Signature Project.
Titanic Belfast celebrates over 250 years of astonishing shipbuilding history that only Belfast owns around the entire world. But the iconic nature of the building itself is inspired by water crystals, icebergs, the White Star of the White Star Lines, but most importantly for us, it's inspired by the great hulls of the ships that were actually built on this shipyard. Oh yeah, of course. Perfect. All right, well then you've already got the detail. That's excellent. All right, well we're good to go then on it. Once we tapped into the magnificent architecture of the scaffolding and the aerial gantry and the building of the ships themselves, you don't have to look anywhere else for such majesty. And the idea of the ship's hulls representing the 4 eras of shipbuilding in Belfast, timber, iron, steel, and aluminium, all of it fell into place. And the clear crystal that nestles between each of those hulls is inspired by the derricks and the scaffolding and the hoarding that was built to build these great ships. And out of that crystal, aligned with the center of the very shipyard and gangways where the Titanic and the Olympic were built together, you can stand and see where all of this happened when Belfast owned the center of invention and innovation in shipbuilding back in the early part of the 20th century. The location of the Titanic Belfast building itself is at the end of the double slipways where the Titanic and the Olympic were built side by side. It actually sits on the ground to the old plating works from view out of the very drawing office where all the drawings were being created that actually allowed the ship to be built. So that intersection of the drawing office, the location of the plating works, and standing at the head of the bow of the ships on the old slipways is a perfect location to tell the story of the richness of all that this part of Belfast has had to offer. This is just absolutely spectacular. It's perfect. Titanic is going to shout to the world about the genius of engineering innovation that Belfast owned. The strength of this building as the largest Titanic exhibition in the world will teach the world about all of the artisans, all of the shipbuilding magnates, all of the great leaders of shipping around the world that was concentrated in Belfast. This is going to restore Belfast as the centerpiece of one of the finest areas of shipbuilding all over the planet.
It really is the biggest thing in the whole Titanic world at the moment, so it can't but help place Belfast right at the forefront of the whole interpretation of the ship.
My personal feeling is that I would prefer this as a shipyard with a lot of sparks, a lot of hammering, a lot of industry going on, and a lot of people working at shipbuilding.
People will be able to come and see, smell, feel and touch shipbuilding where the ship was constructed herself, and I think we should be very proud of ourselves in Belfast to bring this and have this here so people will come and see the true Titanic city.
Finally, we have something that is saying to the world, we built Titanic. Okay, it was a disaster and we must never forget that over 1,500 people died in it, but it was a tragic accident. You cannot blame anything. It was a coming together of circumstances, but it's about time Belfast picked up its place in the Titanic story and that this city becomes known as a Titanic city.
As Belfast mends its broken heart and builds an optimistic future, so too do we mend the name of RMS Titanic, one of the greatest feats of engineering of the 20th century, and, despite her tragic end, a ship that we can rightly be proud of. A ship whose brief life has taught us many lessons. Her legacy is finally coming home, to the place where she was born.